Good morning, everyone. So great to see you all. Welcome to AbSciCon Tuesday, and welcome to Atlanta. I'm Martha Grover. I'm from Georgia Tech, so we're very happy to have you here in Atlanta, and also those of you who are online, to have you joining us virtually. I'd like to start out with a couple of announcements. First of all, I'd like to encourage you all to check out Brain Dates. If you haven't already done that, has anyone checked out Brain Dates already? Yes, good. So we have a lot of great topics already, so you can join one of those discussions. But please don't be shy about suggesting another discussion topic. So just encourage you to go ahead and check out Brain Dates. I'd also like to announce and introduce you to the Astrobiology Diversity and Inclusion Survey, which is led by Arsav Adinolu, who's an assistant professor at Middle East Technical University. So the survey aims to identify whether gender and race impact research careers and is open to anyone who is interested in astrobiology. So all of you, since you're here at the conference. It takes about 20 minutes to complete and is available now through June 16th. But I encourage you to go ahead and fill it out while you're here and it's on your mind. It's available on SurveyMonkey, and you'll be getting the link for that from the conference. So thank you for that, Arsav. And then with that, I'd like to go ahead and get started with our Tuesday plenaries. So we have two speakers here today, both on the topic of Mars exploration. And so after the first speaker, we'll have a few minutes for questions, but then after the second speaker, we'll have a longer question and discussion period with both speakers together. And so we can continue the discussion then. So after the first speaker finishes, if you have a question, come on up to the microphone quickly so we can have a few specific questions, but also keep to our schedule. So our first plenary speaker this morning is Dr. Kathryn Stack-Morgan. Katie is a research scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the deputy project scientist of the Mars 2020 Perseverance Rover, and a participating scientist on the Mars Science Laboratory Curiosity Rover mission. She graduated with a BA in geology and astronomy from Williams College and earned her master's and PhD in geology from Caltech. For her work on the Curiosity rover, she was named to the 2013 Forbes list of 30 under 30 and has earned several NASA Group Achievement Awards and a NASA Software of the Year award. Katie's research focuses on the Martian sedimentary rock record using orbiter and rover image data to understand the evolution of ancient surface processes on Mars. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Kathryn Stack-Morgan.
All right, thank you so much, Martha, for that great introduction. Let me see if I can go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I very much appreciate the opportunity to participate remotely as I'm currently laid up recovering from Achilles rupture surgery. But today I'm very excited to share with you the results from the past year of the Mars 2020 Perseverance Rover mission in Jezero Crater from the perspective of the habitable environments that we have thus far been able to explore with the rover. I did want to give a shout out to Mars 2020 at AbSciCon. I think you heard yesterday from one of our scientists, Ananda Sharma, talking about biosignatures in Jezero. This coming Thursday, we have a number of great talks where you can find out more details about Mars 2020 and the great science and astrobiology that we are doing, and as well as on the online sessions as well. So I'll give an overview here, but very much encourage you all to go to these talks to get more details on what Mars 2020 is up to. All right, so the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover is here in terms of the fleet of NASA Mars missions past and future, building on the fantastic heritage of missions like the Spirit and Opportunity Mars exploration rovers, as well as particularly Curiosity rover that's still currently operating on Mars. And Mars 2020 Perseverance rover feeds into and is the start of a Mars sample return campaign. We'll hear more about that from Minnie later this morning. And we are the first leg of that campaign, whose job is to collect and cache samples on the surface of Mars for potential return to Earth by the Mars sample return missions. Okay, so the Mars 2020 rover has 4 main objectives, and I'll actually start with the first and last and then dig into a bit more detail on the second and third. Like other missions, Mars 2020 is focused on understanding the geology of the landing site that the rover is exploring, understanding what's present, what its geologic history is. And like many missions before it, this mission takes small steps in preparing for human exploration with the inclusion of certain technology demonstrations and exciting engineering capabilities to help get humans to Mars in the future. Specifically though, the 2 objectives that really distinguish this mission are B and C, astrobiology and sample caching. And so in terms of astrobiology, Mars 2020 is seeking signs of ancient life. And so what does that mean for us? So Mars 20, previous missions have also looked for signs of life on Mars, but I think the Mars 2020 rover has a payload that is uniquely suited and probably best suited for finding signs of ancient life on Mars. And so in our search for biosignatures on Mars, we set certain expectations. If life emerged on Mars, it was likely microbial life. So we're talking microscopic, and with the possibility that any soft organic matter that might have made up this life was probably easily degraded and not particularly well preserved in the rock record. Fortunately, though, we know based on our studies of microbes here on Earth that microbes can interact with their environment to trap sediment and precipitate amorphous materials or minerals that we then can see preserved in the rock record with the potential to leave behind biosignatures. And so these interactions result in a wide range of things that we could potentially search for, both in the early rock record of Earth, but on Mars as well. In particular, the Mars 2020 Perseverance rover, with examples over here on the right by Pixel and Sherlock, are particularly well suited for searching for things like biomarkers, morphological biosignatures, as well as some elemental patterns. And so you can see here an example of that with our Pixel and Sherlock instruments. By the combining mapping of elemental geochemistry with organics and mineralogy, coupled with high-resolution images of texture, we have the ability to potentially put together a case for a biosignature on the surface of Mars. And so this particular objective that Mars 2020 has to seek these signs of ancient life on Mars feeds directly into this mission's role as a Mars sample return mission. And again, we'll hear more about this from Minnie later on, but the Perseverance rover carries with it 43 sample tubes, 38 of which are reserved for rock and regolith samples that the rover would collect and store in the rover, eventually putting down on the surface or carrying with it for rock and regolith. We also carry with us 5 witness tubes that can act as a sort of control. These are tubes that we can seal up at any time during the mission to essentially characterize the state of the inside of the rover for the purposes of helping with things like contamination control and to understand whether what we're seeing in our samples when they are eventually turned to Earth, does that come from Earth? Does it come from Mars? Did it come from the rover? And so this is an important aspect of the sample collection and preservation activities that the Perseverance rover has as its prime objectives. So I'll talk a bit about the landing site that Perseverance is exploring, and it's a very active field site. The rover is here in Jezero Crater. This is a perspective view of a high-rise image. And Perseverance is exploring what we believe to be one of the best preserved ancient lake and delta deposits on Mars. We were attracted to this site because it has a diversity of habitable environments and diverse mineralogy as observed from orbit. And it provides this really nice, about 3.5 to 4 billion year old window into planetary evolution, as it is in some of the oldest crust and oldest terrain on the surface of Mars. But we're excuse me, particularly interested in the habitable environments that may be preserved in Jezero Crater. And there are a number that we have identified in terms of general settings in which we think we may have potential habitable environments to explore. So in the floor of the crater, we have olivine-bearing and mafic igneous rocks that could have been capable of supporting water-rock interactions and chemical gradients that might have been supportive of ancient life. Of course, we have the delta itself, and we get excited about the distal rocks of the delta that could include mudstones or even chemical precipitates deposited within the lake that would be ideal for biosignature preservation. And then the potential for the coarse-grained rocks as well on the top surface of the delta, representing higher energy river environments. And while these may not be the best environments for biosignature preservation, there are the potential for some microenvironments within those sedimentary rocks, as well as hitting on the diversity aspect, bringing in diverse samples from outside the crater in the watershed outside Jezero, and concentrating them here in the delta that the Perseverance rover can explore. And lastly, we have some margin deposits on the inside of the crater where we observe carbonates from orbit. And so this is really exciting because the potential that they were deposited in shallow lake margin environments. We haven't yet explored the margins, so my focus today will be on these three other environments. And we'll start off looking at the coarse-grained rocks, actually, as these were some of our very first observations from the surface of Mars. Okay, so back in February of 2021, Perseverance landed here at the Octavia E. Butler landing on the floor of Jezero crater. So while we were about 2 kilometers from the delta, which is one of our main astrobiology targets of the mission, we actually had pretty good views of the delta and took advantage of some of our amazing camera capabilities to see these rocks up close, or far away, but up close. And so we had some great views of the delta, in particular, looking from our landing site here to some of the outcrops on the delta front, as well as in some of these what we call delta remnants, erosional remnants of what we think was a past, formerly more extensive occurrence of the delta. And so this past fall, we published our first results from the mission, actually coming from these, in some cases, telescopic image observations of the delta front, seeing these spectacular boulder deposits within the upper part of the Jezero Delta. Now, these weren't exactly expected. We knew there to expect delta facies, but to see these boulder beds with up to 0.5 meter to almost 1 meter sized boulders really suggested an energy regime and a flow setting that was unexpected. And so we're thinking about the possibility of a drastic change of environment and energy conditions and the deposition of flood deposits essentially in the upper part of the Jezero Delta. But of course, we also have classic delta stratigraphy, and this is the Kodiak Delta remnant, where we see beautiful images of what we believe to be delta top set into foreset and into bottom set beds. And from an astrobiology perspective, we get really excited about the observation of these bottom set beds. Well, these are not particularly accessible by the rover. It suggests to us that elsewhere in the delta, we'll have the opportunity to explore beds just like this. More recent observations have given us an even greater view as we've gotten closer to the delta of some of these spectacular, what we think to be flood deposits. And this is a very recent image coming down from the rover. We were positioned right in front of the delta. And if you look up here at the top, we were all focused on the rocks down here, but up at the top, this spectacular boulder deposit, really big meter-sized boulders, closely packed together in contact with one another, and extremely well-rounded. And so this suggests that we have really high energy floods coming into the crater, depositing these spectacular boulder deposits. And what we're thinking about now, and especially as we seek to understand the lake system here in Jezero, is the longevity of these types of flows and then their intermittency. And this will give us important clues to the habitability and the evolution of this habitable lake environment in Jezero over time. Okay, so now we'll switch focus. That was our very early observation. It's amazing what we could get from so far away from the delta. But now we'll focus on what we observed in these rocks of the crater floor. In particular, our focus here will be on aqueous alteration and the potential water rock interactions that these, what we now know to be igneous rocks, have experienced. Okay, so we spent the first year of the mission exploring 2 major units of the Jezero crater floor. We have the Seitan Formation, which you'll hear me talk about, as well as the Maz Formation. And the Seitan Formation distinguishes itself from orbit by being enriched in olivine, whereas the Maz Formation has a more typical mafic composition as observed from orbiter spectrometers. And so we were very interested in, and it was a fortuitous landing right at the boundary of what looks to be the major geologic contact of the crater floor units. So we're interested to understand what these units were and how they may or may not be related. And for a long time, there was a lot of debate in the science and Mars community about whether these rocks would be sedimentary, volcaniclastic, or igneous. And we didn't know going into the surface mission. And we continued to be a bit befuddled for the early part of the mission. This was very characteristic of the rocks that we saw on the crater floor. They were quite dusty, and as it turned out, they had many of them had a coating on them that prevented us from actually seeing the inner texture or fabric of the rocks. So many of the rocks look like this. We called these the pavers. But looking off into the distance, we had these pretty massive, apparently massive looking rocks, dark rocks. And so we were very much thinking, okay, if these are sedimentary rocks, what kind of environments would these massive rocks represent? We're not seeing a lot of obvious layering, maybe here or there, but not really obvious, and no traction transport bed form structures or anything like that. And so there are only certain depositional settings you could get rocks like that, or these igneous rocks, and could these be igneous basalt lava flows? We eventually got to this area called our Tubi Ridge, where we started to see layered rocks, and in some cases, pretty fine layering. And so this really got us thinking about, well, maybe these rocks could be sedimentary, or maybe we have a mix of sedimentary and volcanic rocks. But ultimately, once we actually got the ability to abrade these rocks, we saw pretty conclusively that their texture was characteristic of a holocrystalline basalt or even a microgabbro, where we have these interlocking crystals of plagioclase and pyroxene. But interestingly, and these are two of our abrasion patches from some of our early rocks, in addition to kind of typical mafic mineralogy, we also had the presence of salt minerals. And I'll show a zoom in here with a spectacular image from the Sherlock ACI camera, zooming in on one of these bugs that is, we now know, filled with a sulfate mineral. And we could be looking at a thin section here. I mean, you can almost even you can just pick out what could be an isopachus rim around the inner part of one of these voids with the sulfate mineral precipitated inside. And so it's incredible what our cameras and our geochemistry instruments and mineralogy instruments can tell us about these rocks once we're able to abrade them. And so the presence of these salt minerals is really exciting. And you'll hear more from Lisa Mayhew about these rocks on Thursday and their astrobiological potential. But we get really excited about the presence of these salts. And I'll show you in this next slide, a nice pixel map overlaid on top showing, yes, indeed, we do have the sulfates popping out here in this rock. Because even though we still have the primary igneous mineralogy present in these rocks, we don't have abundant aluminum clays, suggesting a relatively low water-rock ratio, likely in a closed system. It's still abundantly clear that water interacted with these rocks, moved through these rocks, altered the minerals, primary mineralogy, as well as depositing these evaporite precipitates within the rocks. And so this is really exciting from an astrobiology perspective, thinking about the micro niches that might have formed as water interacted with these primary minerals. Okay, so that was our, our exploration of the mafic rocks of the Maz Formation, but then we had the opportunity to cross into this other unit, the Seitan Formation, and this is the olivine-bearing unit. We didn't quite know, again, the origin of this. Olivine-bearing rocks are kind of unusual here on Earth, and so what was this going to be like on Mars? And so when we had the opportunity to look at these rocks up close, really astounded by the texture of them, where we could actually pick out these individual clasts that did indeed turn out to be olivine. And we were starting to think, is this some kind of ultramafic ash? Are these clastic rocks? But again, the opportunity to abrade and use our proximity science instruments, Pixel and Sherlock, really helped put to bed any questions about the origin of these rocks. I'll show next a scan from the Pixel instrument, showing a beautiful example of a poikilotic texture here, where you have an olivine grain completely surrounded by a pyroxene grain. So pretty much a slam dunk here that these are igneous rocks formed from a magma. So we're looking at here essentially an olivine cumulate here in Jezero crater, also the crater that we have a lake basin in. And so this really got us thinking, what is the geologic context here that would put an olivine cumulate inside this crater? And so we're considering the possibility of a magmatic intrusion, or the possibility of perhaps a deep lava lake. And then what is the relationship between these rocks and the more mafic rocks? Are we looking at the differentiation of a single magma body, or an olivine cumulate with a much later basalt coming in on top. So still some outstanding questions here in the origin, but clearly a diversity of igneous rocks, which gives us great insight into what's happening in the interior of Mars. So really exciting to have the opportunity to explore these rocks. Okay, so in addition, as I mentioned, to the primary igneous mineralogy, also had the opportunity to discover that these rocks have these carbonate and sulfate minerals. And so this is a Sherlock point map showing that we have the olivine crystals here in green, but anywhere you see blue is carbonate. And so really exciting that we have the alteration of olivine to carbonate along these grain boundaries. And what we also see with Sherlock, and Sananda Sharma talked about this yesterday, but correlating with these carbonate and sulfate minerals are organic detections. And so these are 1 and 2 ring, relatively simple organics, but their co-occurrence with these carbonate and sulfate minerals suggests that the organic formation may have been related to the interaction of these minerals with water at their grain boundaries. So again, really exciting for the potential for habitable niches at these very specific microenvironments within igneous rocks, which otherwise may not have really been our prime astrobiology target. But great potential here for these rocks. And this diverse suite of igneous rocks makes up at this point the 8 rock samples that we've currently put in the Perseverance cache. Okay, so I'll wrap up here with just a taste of what the rover is looking at right now and what we have ahead of us. So we will return a bit to the coarse-grained rocks that we may have present in the delta, but also start thinking about some of these distal rocks that might have been deposited in this lake basin. So the rover is here right now. This is the front of the delta, and we arrived at the delta after a long journey that took us about a month and a half. And we arrived here in front of the delta. These are the delta sediments right here. These are the rocks of the crater floor. And we did a loop here in an area called Cannery Passage. And in a couple of slides, I'll show you some images right from here. And the rover has since worked its way over and just yesterday arrived right here, but I'll show you some images here at what are the first sedimentary rocks observed by Perseverance. And so this is the view of that same area on the ground. Beautiful landscape view. This is that Cape Nookshack area. This is Hawksbill Gap, where the rover is currently sitting somewhere over here. And that area we'll zoom into is over here, right at the base of this delta section. And so this was one of our first views of an area that we called Enchanted Lake, perhaps optimistically hoping to find what we wanted to find here. And indeed, we believe these are the first sedimentary rocks encountered by Perseverance. So we'll zoom in here. This is a sandstone, what we now know to be a sandstone that forms the base of this Enchanted Lake outcrop. It has a composition very similar to the Seitan rocks, but it is not Seitan. Instead, we see very clear cross-bedding here, in particular low angle scour and drape geometry, suggesting that these might be related to some kind of either fluvial processes or subaqueous channel deposit. When we zoom in with the SuperCam RMI imager, we can actually resolve small grains. I don't have a scale here, but these are a couple millimeters in diameter, suggesting that they were not deposited by the wind and that we are very clearly looking at a subaqueous deposit. So entirely consistent with the delta setting. But what got our scientists really excited were these potentially fine grain, planar laminated deposits above that sandstone, thinking that these could be the distal lake beds or delta bottom set beds that we are so excited to explore here at the delta. And so this is just the beginning of our exploration of the delta. And so much more to come here. We've pretty much wrapped up our exploration of the crater floor, are in progress of exploring the distal and more proximal deposits of the delta, and have to look ahead of toward the explanation of the carbonates along the margin in the future. And so I'll wrap up here with just putting up our current sample cache, diverse suite of igneous rocks thus far collected, and we hope to fill in these empty rows here with a diverse suite of interesting and astrobiologically compelling sedimentary samples. So I'll wind up here and happy to take any questions.
Okay, we actually have a question from online from Ben Pierce. What is the proposed formation mechanism for the boulders you found in the Jezero crater?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first interpretation we had for them were that they were high energy floods coming into the crater, perhaps related to some upstream process. It could be release or melting of a glacial dam or something like that that caused a catastrophic flow into the crater. However, our very recent observations suggest that we might actually be seeing more of these boulder beds interbedded with some of our finer grained, lower energy sedimentary deposits, suggesting that we might actually be looking at something more like sheet floods and maybe a more common but intermittent process depositing those boulders in that delta sequence.
Question. Let's save our time for the broader discussion afterward in that case. And but let's go ahead and thank Katie very much. And she'll be back for the discussion at the end of the session. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Meenakshi Wadhwa. Minnie is a planetary scientist and isotope cosmochemist interested in the timescales and processes involved in the formation and evolution of the solar system and planets. She received her doctorate from Washington University in St. Louis and was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California at San Diego. She was subsequently curator in the Department of Geology at the Field Museum in Chicago before moving to Arizona State University, where she is professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration and additionally serves as the director of the school. She's appointed as a distinguished visiting scientist and Mars Sample Return Principal Scientist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the J. Lawrence Smith Medal of the National Academy of Sciences. And she became a fellow of the American Geophysical Union in 2019. Asteroid 8356 has been named 8356 Wadhwa in recognition of her contributions to meteoritics and planetary sciences. Thank you, Minnie, for joining us today to present your work.
All right, well, thanks so much for this great introduction. I'm so pleased to be here. So let's have the first slide. Are we all set? Oh, okay, got it. Oh, I see. Sorry about that. Okay, all right, well, so I'm going to be telling you a little bit about Martian samples. And at least at the current time, the only Martian samples that we currently have are the ones that come to us as meteorites. And so I'm going to start out with what we can learn about the astrobiological potential of Mars through studies of those types of materials, and then transition over to talking about the plans that we have for bringing actual samples back from the crust of Mars that Katie just talked about is basically the first stage of doing that. Mars 2020 has already begun that process. And so I'm going to start first with talking about Martian meteorites. So Mars meteorites are really, really close to my heart. I actually started my graduate career starting out as a graduate student studying these materials. And in fact, that's really what kind of drew me to the study of meteorites and cosmochemistry, because I had absolutely no idea that we actually had samples that we think came from the crust of Mars here on Earth. It just blew my mind when I kind of learned that, and I was totally hooked from that point on. At that time, when I started actually studying these Martian meteorites, there were literally just a handful of these rocks that we knew about. But just in these last couple of decades, there have been many, many more meteorites that have been collected in Antarctica, as well as in the desert regions of the world, Saharan deserts in particular. And at the current time, we believe there are about 178 that we can count that are distinct Martian meteorites, not paired samples, but distinct samples that we think came from the planet Mars. All except one of them, and this is known as the Northwest Africa 7034 also known as Black Beauty. There's only one that is not an igneous rock. All others are igneous rocks that date to about 4.1 to about 150 million years. So these are all primarily igneous materials, and you can see here on the slide, basically the data that was acquired many, many decades ago now, but which really firmly established for the first time that these rocks indeed come from the planet Mars. And that's basically this graph that shows gases that are released from this particular meteorite, EET 79001. It was one of the first meteorites that was actually collected in Antarctica, part of the 1979 field season. And it actually contains these impact melt gases that when these are heated up, they actually release gases, which when compared to the Martian atmosphere, which had been measured fairly recently at that time, this is in the 1980s, by the Viking spacecraft. And so we see this really beautiful one-to-one correlation, which really kind of helps to pinpoint a Martian origin for these rocks. And then, of course, the oxygen isotope compositions of all of these rocks all align along a single slope half line that's different from that of the Earth and other meteorites, and so we can connect them all together and indicate that, in fact, these rocks actually came from Mars. And so this is just to show you sort of the diversity of materials that we think come from Mars in terms of their igneous textures. And as I mentioned, primarily most of these things are igneous rocks. 177 of them, of the 178 that I just mentioned, are igneous rocks. And you can see all the different types of textures ranging from basically basaltic materials, mostly plagioclase pyroxene with some olivine in there, some of the same kinds of textures that Katie was talking about, the poikilotic textures. You can see those in the ones that we call shergatites, for example. And then on the left-hand side, you can see clinopyroxenite, the naclites. And these are cumulate rocks that are primarily made up of augite pyroxenes. And then on the lower left-hand side, you can see the Allen Hills 84001 orthopyroxenite, which of course many of you probably have already heard about that rock, which was the one that the 1996 study by McKay et al. Had proposed that there was evidence of past biogenic life in this rock. But we'll get to that in just a minute. But all of these are igneous materials. They have igneous textures. As I mentioned, they range in ages from about 150 million years or so for the youngest shergatites to about 4.1 billion years for the ALH 84001 orthopyroxenite. And then there's this one regolith breccia, the 7034, that's shown on the lower right, which is actually an agglomeration of different clasts that are, some of them are actually described as sedimentary, but really what they are proto-breccias. They're clasts that we think could have been either produced by impact melts or perhaps some kind of pyroclastic deposits, and possibly some sort of sedimentological process as well. So this is a very interesting rock. It's got the most amount of water, bulk abundance of water of any of the Martian meteorites, about 1 weight% or so. So Martian samples that are available for study, as I mentioned, most of them are igneous rocks, but from the astrobiological perspective, there are, I would say, 3 particular types of these meteoritic materials that are of interest. And what I'm going to do next is basically just tell you a little bit about, and this is not going to be comprehensive by any means, but I'll give examples of the kinds of things that have provided some basis for gauging the astrobiological potential of Mars based on these types of materials. So the kinds of materials that are interesting from the meteoritic collection, number one, you have igneous Martian meteorites that show clear evidence of alteration caused by fluids on Mars. And so you have materials such as Ittingsite and the naclites, carbonates in ALH 84001. So these are all materials that were secondary alteration products produced as a result of interaction with either aqueous or hydrothermal fluids on the surface of Mars. The second one, of course, is this unique regolith breccia in Northwest Africa 7034. And as I mentioned, this has about the highest bulk abundance of water of any of the known Martian meteorites, about 1 weight% or so, as determined by Carl Agee and colleagues in a paper that was published almost a decade ago now. And then, as I mentioned, also presence of some sedimentary clasts as well. So it's not all igneous materials purportedly. And then the one Martian meteorite that is also of interest is one that is the freshest of the falls. So among the 178 meteorites that I just talked about, there are only 5, literally just 5, that are observed falls. And these are, of course, interesting because these have been observed to fall and then have been stored in collections and have not been sitting around in the terrestrial environment getting altered. And so the ones that we have, the 5 that I mentioned, they range in their fall dates from sometime in the 1800s to the most recent one, which is Seitan, which fell in 2011. So again, just about a decade ago or so. And so the next freshest one actually fell in 1960, so over half a century ago. So this is clearly one of interest because if you're looking for organic compounds as well as other types of salts and other materials that otherwise could be altered pretty significantly in the terrestrial environment, you want to be looking at something that's relatively fresh. And so that's, again, something that is of great interest from the astrobiological perspective. So I'm going to, as I mentioned, give a little bit of an example of each one of these to give you a perspective on how these are actually useful from that standpoint and what the limitations are as well. So on this slide, I'm showing here on the left-hand side some of the Idding-site veins. And Idding-site is basically just this sort of mishmash or mixture of these alteration products that are produced as a result of alteration of olivine. And so it's things like clays as well as ferrohydrites, and so it's got this sort of orangish stained color that you see on the left-hand side, upper left side here. And so you can see Idding-site here in Lafayette on the top, on the left, and you can see also some close-up of some of the Idding-site in Nakhla. And so on the right-hand side, on the other hand, you've got carbonates in the ALH-001 Martian meteorite. And these are the very carbonates that actually the study by, at this point, the historic study by in McKay et al. 1996, where they had basically provided 4 lines of evidence to suggest that there was evidence of past biologic activity on Mars based on what they found in this particular meteorite, including the presence of these carbonates that they highlighted the fact that these were deposited by water. There was associated organics. There was also associated magnetites that were in association with some of the other phases that were the presence of both oxidized and reduced phases, which they suggested indicated the presence of some sort of biogenic activity in the past. So that was of course, a historic study, but I'm going to give you an example now of a recent study by Steele et al., which just published this past February. And they applied co-located nanoscale analyses of basically looking at the textures as well as isotope compositions, TEM studies, as well as some of the isotopic compositions that were measured on the same samples. And what they saw was that there were 2 different types of associations of magnetite in this particular meteorite. And I'm showing the 2 different examples, one on the top, one on the bottom on the left-hand side of the screen here. And you can see on the left here that some of the magnetites are associated with talc-like minerals. So they are basically suggesting some kind of serpentinization reaction. And on the bottom, you see that some of the carbonates are basically associated, the magnetites associated with carbonates and orthopyroxenes, as well as some amorphous orthopyroxenes as well. And that is basically indicative, as these authors suggest, of carbonation reactions. And these are all associated with organics. And other associations that are devoid of the magnetite are basically free of organic materials. And so what this study suggested was that, in fact, abiotic synthesis was the important process that was producing these organics as a result of aqueous hydrothermal alteration on the surface of Mars. And so they basically are, again, refuting the claims, the original ones, of course, by McKay et al., that these carbonates, as well as the organics, were biogenic. And so, in fact, it's been suggested now by several different studies that this is likely to be inorganic synthesis. The second example of NWA 7034 is basically this Martian regolith breccia. And here is an example of a false color backscattered electron image that shows now all of the different types of clasts that make up this particular rock. And the interesting thing about this material, not just the fact that it has about 1% water, but also that among all of the Martian meteorites that we know about, this is the only one that has a bulk composition that actually is similar to the compositions that have been measured from orbit, which is this GRS indicated by this yellow square, which I'm not sure that you can see very well, but on the plot on the right-hand side, what's indicated as GRS, that's the remote observation of the surface of Mars, the compositions, and then the red dots are all of the Rover determined compositions of the rocks that have been determined, I guess, prior to 2013 by the Spirit and Opportunity rovers. And so the blue dot that you see there, that's a bulk composition of this particular meteorite, and it lands right in the middle of the compositions that are actually we're measuring on the surface of Mars. And the Martian meteorites, the ones that we know about, the SNC meteorites, are in this pink blob right here, which is quite different actually. And so these meteorites, by and large, are not representative of the crust of Mars as we know it, but this particular rock, 7034, seems to be an average composition. So a lot has been studied in this particular rock in the last 10 years or so. And in fact, there was a paper that came out just again in February of 2022, which reviews all of the information that's been acquired. In my own laboratory, we've actually studied the water contents and D to H ratios in various minerals in these different clasts. And there have been a lot of other chronological investigations that have been done as well. And based on all of these, they've compiled basically a history of this particular regolith and its Martian habitability record. And so this is basically summarizing what we know from looking at this one meteorite about what we can understand about the habitability of the region of Mars where this particular rock came from. So basically, the numbers correspond here to the numbers on this timeline that's shown on the bottom. And so number 1, which is right around 4450 to 4200 million years, is when you had a crustal building and early volcanism happening on Mars. That's recorded in some of the ages, the geochronology of some of the zircons in this particular meteorite. And then there was sedimentological processes and surface reworking that's shown by this dashed line here indicated by a 2. And so this was a long time period over which we don't really know exactly when this happened, but there was probably a lot of impacts that were happening on Mars at the time. And so somewhere in between the sort of igneous formation of this rock, as well as the start of these sedimentological processes, there might have been a period of planetary habitability somewhere early on in the Noachian. And subsequent to that, there was a lithification, a huge impact sometime around 1500 million years ago. And that's shown here as number 3. And then after that, there was some post-impact hydrothermal alteration that's shown by 4 and 5. And then eventually, it's excavated and ejected from the surface of Mars only about 5 to 15 million years ago. And then, of course, terrestrial alteration here on the surface of the Earth. And so that's basically the history from studying this particular meteorite. Now, Seitan, this is the last one, example that I'm going to give you. This is the one that's the freshest Martian meteorite fall. And here are some images of this fresh rock. You can see the beautiful fusion crust that's not at all altered. And the backscattered electron image on the left side here, lower left, shows the texture, which is it has some olivine phenocrysts in a ground mass of pyroxene and plagioclase. And this particular rock, so there's a recent study by Jaramillo et al., 2019, where they analyzed organics as well as some soluble salts from this particular meteorite. And on the left-hand side, actually, it shows sort of a comparison. So they analyzed the meteorite as well as some of the local soils, some wetter as well as some drier soils from the strewn field, the area where this meteorite was formed. And so they compared the two, and they found that there were actually quite significant differences between what they found in the meteorite and what they found in the soils where this meteorite came from. And they also looked at the soluble salts in these things, and that they found differences also as well. And so what they basically suggested based on this was that this particular meteorite was not contaminated significantly in the terrestrial environment, and that the soluble salts were likely deposited by Martian brines similar to terrestrial seawater. We actually, in my group, we had studied the age of this particular rock. We had determined that this was about 600 million years old based on samarium, neodymium, rubidium, strontium dating of this rock. And so what this suggests in combination with the work that that Jaramillo et al. Did is that, in fact, this crustal fluid interaction happened somewhere less than 600 million years ago on Mars. And so this implies the presence of temporary but potentially habitable brines sometime during the Amazonian. The problem, though, is that, in fact, we actually did this experiment on this particular rock to see how fast terrestrial alteration can actually mess up things. And so we took 3 pieces of Tissant, and we basically put them out in the desert, and we analyzed one right away, and then we analyzed one a year later, and another one 3 years later. And so we measured the water abundances and D to H ratios, and basically this is what we found. We measured basically a mineral that is naturally has very low abundances of water. And so what we found is that the fresh Tissant, which is shown here in the black dots, this is where it falls, and this is after no exposure to the Earth in the terrestrial environment. But as soon as you put it out in the environment, within a year, it gets altered very significantly. And you see all this distribution of data where you have higher water abundances and lower delta D values. And so the fresh Tissant actually has high D to H ratios, whereas the altered ones don't. And so significant alteration happens very, very quickly. And so meteorites are prone to that. And so we have, it's not just the alteration that makes a difference, it's also the fact that we don't have the geologic context from where they came from. And then the process of actually delivering these samples screws them up even more, because the impact process, of course, shocks these rocks. And so sometimes some of the signatures that we see, we can't be entirely sure whether they're a result of shock or if they're a result of terrestrial alteration. And so rigorous assessment of the astrobiological potential of Mars really requires sample return. And so Katie just talked about the fact that Mars 2020 is already on its way to collecting rocks. And here is just a little summary showing all of the different rocks that have been collected so far. What you're seeing here are the abraded patches as well as the cores, the 2 rock. They've basically been taking paired samples from each rock type that they've collected. And so there's 4 localities that have been collected so far. And these represent basalts as well as some of these olivine carbonate rocks that Katie talked about. So we've got 4 pairs of rocks, 1 atmosphere sample, and 1 witness tube at the current time. So basically, the samples that we have already got as part of the cache that's on Mars 2020 right now, as well as those that Katie mentioned, that we're going to be sampling the Delta region in Jezero Crater pretty soon. All of those samples together, we believe, will address each of the high priority science goals that were identified by the community. And this was published recently in 2019 in the IMOST report. And they identified basically 7 high-level goals, of which the geological environment and life goals are actually I've highlighted a few of those to show that those ones are going to be particularly important to determine the geologic context of the samples. And then, of course, the biosignatures, in particular, the focus is going to be, of course, on ancient biosignatures. There's very low likelihood of modern biosignatures, but still, we will have the means to actually make those assessments and to study these well-characterized to determine that. So all of these samples will actually be able to address all of these high-priority goals from analyses of these materials. So this is actually just then a notional architecture at the current time. This is still in work. We are currently in phase A for the Mars Sample Return Program. And so Mars 2020 is actually part of it's the initial phase of the Mars Sample Return campaign, and the Mars Sample Return program is the next phase, which will basically comprise of a couple of missions, the Earth Return Orbiter and the Sample Retrieval Lander. And so both of those are actually going to be launched sometime, we believe, in the 2027, 2028 timeframe. And then we hope to bring these samples back by 2033. So these are then just the different aspects of the Mars Sample Return program and the sample science integrity considerations that are clearly going to be very important for thinking about these materials as we bring them back. In particular, the things that we are most concerned about are contamination limits and contamination knowledge. We want to make sure the mechanical integrity of the samples as well as the tubes, which is the return sample tube assemblies, is maintained. The magnetic field limits are also of concern, as well as the temperature histories. And so we're making sure that all of these things are taken into consideration. The current status basically is that we are in phase A. I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but basically we're currently ensuring alignment with Class A mission requirements, meaning that this is a high priority mission. And the mission timeline and basically the architecture are still in the process of being confirmed at this point. So I'm going to be happy to take any questions at this point. I know I'm a couple of minutes over my time, so if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
So Minnie and I will sit down in these chairs over here. Katie will also join us. And please head over to the microphone with your questions. Katie's back here. Can we hear you, Katie?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. So I'll go ahead and start, and then Jen maybe take some from online also. So I would like to hear, I guess, from both of you, just from your own personal, curiosity, what you are most, really interested, looking for as data is coming in, or what do you really want to know that you think, that the next data might be able to tell you? Maybe you can start with Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, of course, the first question we're all asking is, were there signs of ancient life on Mars? Every single mission that has gone to Mars has discovered habitable environments. So we've pretty much answered that question. Mars was a habitable planet. And so then the question is, can we take that next step in understanding whether life actually existed on Mars? And so, the opportunity to use the Mars 2020 data in situ on the surface of Mars to identify possible biosignatures is so exciting to me. And the thought that then feeds into what could be a total paradigm shift in terms of how we think about life in the solar system, life in the universe. It's incredibly exciting to be a part of an effort like that. And then knowing that the work that we're doing, the day-to-day grind that we do on Rover mission ops is enabling such great science for decades to come. And so, it's such an honor, and I feel so lucky to be a part of that effort. And that's really what I think keeps me going every day.
Thank you, Katie. Will you have any thoughts you'd like to share, Minnie?
Well, I mentioned the fact that I started out as a graduate student studying Martian meteorites, and at that point, and I won't say exactly how long ago that was, but it was always, Mars Sample Return was 10 years down the road, always 10 years down the road, always 10 years down the road. And now this is the first time that it actually feels like it is on its way. We're already collecting those rocks, we're caching those rocks. We're in phase A, there's actual funding to support the work. And it's super exciting to me to think that we'll actually bring these samples back and we'll be studying them for decades to come. The lunar samples that we brought back from the moon, they opened those, some tubes that have been sealed for 50 years, they opened them last year. And so, this is going to be a treasure trove that we're going to be utilizing for decades to come. And so, yeah, I can't wait.
Thank you. Let's take a question from the microphone. Go ahead.
Thanks very much for a great set of talks. You mentioned that for some of these meteorites, they have different ages, and if you heat them up, they release gases that are representative of the Martian atmosphere. Can you use that to somehow track the evolution of the Martian atmosphere over time?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, you know, the meteorites that have been studied in that mode, there's two of them actually for which that analysis has been done, and they're both shergottites, and they're both about 150 to 160 million years old. But that's not the atmosphere that you're sampling. What you're sampling is the atmosphere at the time of the ejection event, the impact that caused some of the melting in the rock that ejected it. And that happened less than 20 million years ago for all of the Martian meteorites. For the ones that were actually measured, that happened about maybe 2 to 3 million years ago. And there's not a whole lot that's happened to the Martian atmosphere and over that short span of time. So I wish there were actually ways to actually look at sort of samples that maybe have longer ejection ages, but we don't really have we don't have a huge spread in that time.
Thank you.
I'll add one thing I'll add actually to that answer is that's what makes it so exciting for us to identify things like carbonate in the samples that we are collecting with Perseverance, because the potential to have carbonate forming in a surface near subsurface environment is what gives us the potential to actually record the Martian environment at the time that carbonate formed in the very distant past. And so the potential to bring those, for example, the carbonate-bearing rocks back to Earth and have the ability to study ancient climate using some of the very conventional isotopic techniques that we use to understand past environment and atmosphere here on Earth, we have that potential with minerals like carbonate in the Martian samples that Perseverance is collecting.
Exactly. Now, I think that's such a great point. The meteorites are, I just mentioned, there are limitations to these things, and absolutely, we need to get these samples back to really be able to do the kinds of cool things that Katie just mentioned.
Okay, let's take next question.
University of Florida. I was wondering about the SNC meteorites, if you're learning anything about the passage, the timeline with some of these newer SNC meteorites, if you're learning anything more about the radiation exposure, how that's affecting, and just overall, how long is it taking to get from Mars to Earth?
Yeah, so, absolutely. I think it's been shown by modeling efforts that really the transit time from Mars to Earth is relatively short. It's on order of 10 to 20 million years. And that's what we're seeing for most of these Martian meteorites, actually. The exposure ages for these Martian meteorites is at most about 20 million years, something like that. I'm sure there have been Martian meteorites have been coming to Earth throughout the geologic history of the Earth, but they clearly, we're only seeing the most recent ones because they're the only ones that have survived, right? So what we're learning though is that at least the ones that we have in our collections, they're all less than 20 million years, and it's consistent with theoretical modeling of that.
Thank you.
Okay, do you have any questions online, Jen?
We do. Question for Minnie. Given that terrestrial alteration happens so rapidly, could this have also affected the high bulk water content in the regolith breccia NWA 7034?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's had a terrestrial residence time, I believe, of a few tens of thousands of years, but the amount of water that it would take to actually alter it to that great extent would be a lot, right? I mean, if you started out with something like a few hundred parts per million, which is typical of the other Martian meteorites, to get it up to a weight percent would mean a significant amount of contamination, in which case you would not see the D to H, the hydrogen isotope ratios in the sample. We see a range in them, right? I mean, we see relatively high values up to maybe plus 1,500 to 2,000, down to near terrestrial values. If all of that water had been terrestrial, you would see basically terrestrial D to H ratios. So I think there's been some alteration, but not everything has, not all that water could be terrestrial.
So I think it's time for us to continue our discussions over coffee. And for the rest of the day, let's thank Katie and Minnie once again. Wonderful dual plenary.